By Gramil Mahagat Chahirlig, Agus Gramil Mahagusha, as special and over the kind to Shanacht. And I would also like to thank the Common Irish Anna Chuin, Anna Down Heritage Society, for inviting me to talk to you on a subject which is of interest to me, being a remarkable manifestation of folk tradition and belief. The customs I'll be referring to in the talk are largely those described in folklore records from the Gaeltacht areas in West Galway and Kerry. But I think it is reasonable to assume that, allowing for local variation and the fact that there isn't uniformity in practice throughout the country, that the examples, let's say, that I will present are fairly representative of many communities throughout the country. My intention and my plan in the talk is to present Cillíní in the context of other practices that form part of children's funerary rites, wake and funeral especially, and then attempt to offer an explanation as to why they differed so radically from those that accompanied the death of adults. A hallmark of children's funerary rites, in contrast with those of adults, is their abridged and less elaborate form. Indeed, some traditional features associated with the death of adults are generally absent. So, for example, the most distinctive death omen in Irish tradition, the crying of the banshee, is hardly ever attested in relation to the death of a child. And generally speaking, death omens are not sort of spoken of in the context of child death. The ritual of laying out the dead child differed greatly from that of adults. Unless baptism had been administered by a priest, the infant wasn't clothed in any special garb after death, but placed in a cradle or in its mother's bed awaiting removal. Even when a child had been baptized in church and was sufficiently grown to be laid out on a table or on a board in white dress, it wasn't accorded a significant feature of ritual implied in the laying out of adults. It was customary, when an adult was being laid out, that he would be provided with sort of an enclosed space by sheets hung suspended from the ceiling, one at either end, and another on the left-hand side, and another overhead as a canopy. And this structure was not used in the case of child death. Other aspects of funerary ritual were also curtailed. Most tellingly, in the view of the centrality of the wake in Irish funerary tradition, it frequently happened that a child wasn't waked at all. This was invariably so in the case of those who had received lay baptism and died pretty soon after death. It appears to have been customary also in various parts of the country for children baptized in church to be buried a few hours after death. This rather hasty dispatch is in sharp contrast with the 2 full days which normally elapse between the death and burial of an adult. The practice on the Blasket is illustrated in accounts of young children's deaths in the writing of island authors. And at this stage, I will need to avail of the first slide, please, just to add sort of weight to what I've said. Where the slides are, the original is in Irish, then there's an English translation provided. And if it's okay, I'll read the Irish and you can read the English. Okay. Yes, very good. Thank you, Margaret. So here we are then. Bí an garach le lacaamach godas igliavan hevati gurhola dinne gur in a colahov vishi near a vein torov le behite tishk eve ho vein torov. Scholterchen boher lanav blianan uro nu beidir nínáin na bech puin da héal feiceige, ní bhíon an tóramh fáiste den tórsa. In some areas, it was customary to wake children who had received church baptism, but then the wake lasted one night only, rather than two, as was the norm for adults. Alcoholic drink, a central element in the traditional wake, was generally not offered to participants at children's wake, and in parts of the country, neither was tobacco. The absence of either of these substances from the wake represents a considerable diminution in ritual. The absence of tobacco is all the more remarkable, as in Irish folklore, legends tell us that tobacco was first used by the Virgin Mary at the foot of the cross to relieve her grief. And another story tells us how Christ on earth urged people to use tobacco or snuff at wakes. So the tobacco was very closely tied to a sort of sacred precedent, if you like. Similarly, storytelling and wake games or other forms of merriment were not features of a child's wake. Neither was it customary to perform the traditional lament known as the Keen for children. For instance, a record from County Longford, referring to an attempt by local clergy in post-famine times to extirpate the practice of keening at wakes, they arranged for the church choir to sing at funerals. And the record goes on to say that in the case of children's funerals, there was no need to tell the choir to perform because there wouldn't be a keen in any case. However, practice varied. An account from Clonmel, Tipperary in 1732 tells us how a child was attended to its grave with an Irish howl. And recently, a West Galway informant, recalling a well-known keening woman, declared that her most heartrending performances were reserved for children. Fáistín beag, he said, dus gloch a glór na spera, her crying would tear the skies asunder. The last rites weren't administered to children under 7, as they were not deemed to have attained the use of reason, and neither then was it customary for a priest to officiate at their burial, nor were funeral offerings taken up in those areas where it was the practice. From the end of the 19th century, the Catholic clergy, seeking to eliminate what were seen as abuses at wakes, had urged that remains of the deceased be brought to the church the evening before interment. And this practice gradually got established throughout the country, but in the case of children, it was not. Again, mourning for a child, if observed at all, was of much shorter duration than the year-long mourning period, which was usual for adults. The most significant differences between the funerary rites of children and those of adults relate to burial. Firstly, in marked contrast to the socially oriented timing of adult burials, it was customary for the burial of stillborn or very young children to take place secretly at nighttime. In parts of the country, a young child dying during the night was buried before daybreak. The hour of death generally determined the timing of the burial, and in some localities, a child who had died before noon was buried the same day. Children's burial often took place either as evening was falling or the early morning. Le fuor and Tronhona, no gomuch madden. The frequently improvised nature of the child's coffin and the sparse attendance at the funeral, usually just a few family members, were further indications of the distinction made between the death of a child and that of an adult. We come now to the place of burial, and very much at variance with modern sensitivity was the practice of burying the young, be they stillborn, infants, or young children, in places other than the family grave in the consecrated cemetery. The sites of such burials include places such as the haggard or a garden close to the house or a lone thorn bush. Soon after coming to live in Cosharaga in the early 80s, I was very surprised when an elderly neighbour took me to see a spot in a boundary fence where he himself had buried a stillborn child some 50 years earlier. Other locations include burial grounds known as Cillíní, Calúri, Celtric, Lishini, sited in locations such as Elis or Rath, at a boundary fence, crossroads, or besides a river, well, lake, or foreshore. And here is one such place. This level area here by the this is the sea inlet, and many of these are located in what are called liminal places. In other words, on the edge or on a border. And this one is back near Castla, close to where Radio Gaeltacht operates from. This is another one here inside that stone ditch back in Muiras, beyond Rossaville. And all that remains now, really, unless somebody knew it, you wouldn't really know anything was happening there. And if we look at this one, it shows us how, this is included to show how many of these sites are unidentified and will soon be unidentifiable, because the elderly people who know where they are, I doubt if the younger generation will pick up this knowledge. So the harshness of some of these burials and the minimalist nature of the ritual associated with them is clear from this account collected for the Irish Folklore Commission in West Galway in 1939. An chi a cuirtar páiste a ein spáiste úr láir, nó páiste a rugadh marv, nó páiste nach bhain sacrament a waiste, is sundul gomín seanadhan a freastal van nuair a bertar an páiste. Agus má bhíonn an páiste sin lag agus é an bhfuil a bháis, tugtar baiste úr láir da. Agus is íon tanadhan seo a thugann an baiste úr láir a gcónaí, má aon an páiste sin bás, sul le maiste go sagarta, caffar é chur I dóran idir gá bhaile. Nuair atá an páiste básathe, is íon tanadhan seo a bhreathnaíonn ina bhíag. Cuir is í seanad a char timpeall an páiste, agus geo sí fearmhaointeach le máthir an páiste, agus raige bhirrtacha, an fearsa gúmpar an páiste faoin oscail, agus an tanadhan agsúil an hengilis. Agus beag lái ag an bhar, agus buine sé Paul sa tóran, agus caffar a páiste síosán, agus dúna séir. Sin é an méid identity leis báiste. That is really quite shocking to our sensitivities today. But Sinead, the enduring anguish that this caused to especially mothers is masterfully displayed in Martin O'Kine's short story on Stranshare, of talking of a woman who had 5 stillbirths, and the husband went off and buried them, and eventually she figured out where it was, and her heartbreak, which lasted through her lifetime, is palpable in that story. Now, going back in history, we find segregated burial of children, often presumably with little or no ritual, was the norm in ancient civilizations such as Greece and Rome, and that is also true of some present-day so-called primitive cultures in Africa and East Asia. In Ireland, distinctive disposal of the bodies of children has also been noted in some Bronze Age burial sites, where excavations have revealed a pattern of cremation of adults, but interment of children. In pre-Roman Britain, it was customary to bury infants apart from adults in ditches, pits, or rubbish dumps. And archaeological excavations in Bronze Age burial sites in both Britain and Ireland have revealed that children's remains are significantly underrepresented, a fact taken to indicate that they were buried apart and probably with less formal manner than adults. The recent excavation of the ancient site at Ranelagh near Roscommon town has revealed a pattern of orientation and positioning of the bodies of babies and young children differing from that of adults buried there, leading the authors of the report on the excavation to say, it is possible that less formal burial practices were sometimes considered acceptable for interment of the very young. In the Roman world, the adoption of Christianity has been shown to be a critical factor in ending segregated burial of children and augmenting the funerary recognition given them. While it would be mistaken to think that the introduction of Christianity led to an immediate improvement in the treatment of children, nonetheless, it did bring about some enhancement in the status of the child. As one author puts it, and I quote, "There can be no doubt that the importance accorded to the child's personality was linked with the growing influence of Christianity on life and manners." In the Irish context, for instance, this influence is exemplified in a provision of early law relating to the honour price of children. This is a quote, Kelly Gaeltacht. "The influence of Christianity is clearly responsible for the high legal worth of a young child. According to Greta Crowley, that's an 8th century law text, the honour price of a child between baptism and the age of 7 is the same as that of a cleric. Consequently, any injury inflicted on a young child entails heavy penalties, no matter what social class he or she belongs to." In the early centuries of the Christian era in Ireland, the cremation of the dead was gradually replaced by burial. But it is not clear whether this change reflects the influence of Christianity or merely a broader Roman influence. After Christianity became dominant, let's say the 8th, 9th century, burials of the dead was established as the normal practice. And under church guidance, cemeteries were developed as places of repose for all the faithful. The word cemetery derived from the Greek word for a bedroom, and early Christians looked on the cemetery as a dormitory for the dead awaiting resurrection. Given that in Christian teaching, children are afforded a privileged status as sinless members of the church, it is reasonable to expect that in a Christian community, they would be buried in consecrated ground. And indeed, the evidence from excavated early church cemeteries indicates that this was so, as the bodies of children were found beside those of adults. However, considering that only a very tiny number of ancient burial sites have been excavated, it seems possible that alternative arrangements for child burial existed, which are not reflected in the excavated cemeteries. Death customs and beliefs can undoubtedly be of great antiquity, and it may be that practices relating to child burial in later centuries reflect pre-Christian tradition, as might be inferred, perhaps, from the words of this historian. "It would be unwise to presume that burial in traditional non-Christian sites and non-Christian burial practices could not have survived in Ireland to some extent into the 10th century and later, especially in the more remote and inaccessible areas of the island." Whether or not that was the case, the puzzling fact is that archaeological evidence shows that from early medieval times, say about the 12th century, but more usually a few centuries later, special burial grounds for children are an established feature of the Irish countryside. It's not clear why children's burial grounds developed when they did, but almost 1,500 of these sites are now documented throughout the country, particularly prevalent in the west and southwest, with well over 450 in County Galway. Though some ceased to be used between the 16th and 18th century, the vast majority of them continued to be utilized until post-famine times, when the practice went into sharp decline. However, a few were still being used into the second half of the 20th century. One in County Mayo, one on record, is 1964, the last one that we're aware of, I'm aware of. It has been pointed out that the introduction of the Act of Registration of Births and Deaths in 1863 was hugely influential in discouraging the practice, and passing the Infanticide Act in 1949 would have added further impetus to its abandonment, making the hushed burial of infants likely to arouse suspicion. In later tradition, they are commonly referred to as burial places of unbaptized infants, even though occasionally adults were interred in them when their religious or moral status was uncertain, as was the case, for instance, with bodies washed ashore or strangers passing through the place in time. If these sites originated in response to the canonical prohibition on burial of the unbaptized in Christian cemeteries, then one would expect to find such burial grounds throughout Christendom, And as far as I'm aware, children's burial grounds removed from a cemetery, segregated burial, is a uniquely Irish phenomenon. It is a fact, however, that burial of children in less honourable locations than adults and treating their death with diminished ceremony were not atypical practices in Europe in the modern period. A study of burial practices in France, for instance, at the turn of the 18th century, shows that while adults belonging to the better off classes were interred within the church, this was the most desirable place to be buried. Cemeteries had been developing around this time, and what the study shows is that the adults continued to be buried in the church, but most of the children were in the cemeteries. And in German towns in the 16th and 17th century, it was customary for the town crier to announce the death of adults, but not the children, leading the criers to complain at their loss of income due to this practice. Now, despite Cillíní being frequently referred to as burial grounds for unbaptized children, interment in them of baptized infants and older children was common practice. The situation on the Great Blasket illustrates this clearly. Each of the island families had its ancestral graveyard on the mainland, where all the adults were buried, yet all their deceased children, baptized and in some cases even confirmed, were interred in a burial ground on the island, where only occasionally adults were buried. Coming nearer home, Sean O'Murchu, telling his story on this society's impressive website, explicitly states that his 6-month-old sister, buried in the children's burial ground at Cillíní, was baptized. And incidentally, I would like to thank Leo for arranging for me to meet with Sean. I had the pleasure of meeting Sean, a great exponent of contentment in old age. As Leo took me to have a look at the Cillíní at Cillíní. Oral traditions make it clear that young children, all presumably baptized, were regularly buried in Cillíní. I mean, we can take it, I think, as fact that children of one age or 1 year of age or upward certainly would have been baptized in the Irish context. And archaeological excavations carried out on a number of these sites indicate that children aged 2, 4, 7, 10, and even 11 were interred in them, all of whom we may again presume to have been baptized. So the determinant for burial of children in Cillíní appears then to be age and not religious status. Now, a word about religious status. The necessity of baptism to ensure salvation was a doctrine long promoted in Irish society, as was the obligation on anyone in a position to do so, lay or cleric, to administer the sacrament to a worthy recipient in danger of death. The administration of lay baptism was a duty specifically assigned to midwives in former times, whose license to practice was sometimes obtained from a bishop. And in the absence of a midwife, it is reasonable to assume that parents would wish to ensure the eternal happiness of their child. The West Galway text quoted earlier shows that immediately the life of an infant was felt to be endangered, lay baptism was promptly administered. Church teaching does not distinguish between the essential efficacy of baptism administered by a layperson and that administered by a cleric. Canon law simply states that through baptism, people are incorporated into the church, and consequently, it is probably safe to say that hardly any burials in Cillíní involved unbaptized children. The burial of children in places other than the family graveyard is all the more remarkable in the Irish context because of the heavy duty imposed by tradition on family and community to ensure that people were buried in their ancestral graveyard. Really, the old people believed that everybody should be is minnig na dentiation agus the hagach Gaeltacht on the Nevada, the Vado Valagaminnig. Is the agus Horgudishan Corp, agus Hugadish Logadi down to Duchus. Shows how deeply the sentiment was. The desire to be buried among one's ancestral burial ground is a feature of many cultures. In Irish tradition, the gravity of observing the practice of burial in the ancestral graveyard is dramatically emphasized in stories of how dead relatives would come to bring the body to its proper burial place. There's one story, for instance, of two men who were working far from home, and one was dying, and he asked his companion when he was dead to decapitate him and bring his head back to his ancestral cemetery. This was a practice in medieval times. Noblemen dying in wars abroad would have bones brought back. The body would be boiled and the flesh buried wherever the death had occurred, and then the bones or parts of them brought home to the man's ancestral graveyard. In any case, the companion fulfilled his obligation and brought the head, the decapitated head, to his grave. And then sometime later, when the grave was opened, they found that the entire body was in the grave. So that there was an interest from the other side in ensuring that this was done. So people went to great lengths to fulfill this obligation. For example, the early collector of Irish folklore, Crofton Croker, in the 1820s, tells of the daughter of a beggar woman in Cork. The beggar woman was dying and asked her daughter make sure that she got buried in the proper graveyard. And the daughter didn't have the means to employ anybody to drive, take the corpse to the graveyard. And she got a rope and dragged the attached it to the coffin and dragged the coffin for more than 10 miles to ensure burial in the proper place. This attachment of Irish people has also sort of been a theme for writers, Dr Ó Héalaí, Frank O'Connor, Seamus O'Kelly. And traditional stories tell of people being unhappy if they're not buried in the proper graveyard, turning to communicate their dissatisfaction to their families. Táimse and seo, says one of them, mar a bheith gé iasachta idir scata géama, priúc agus giúb a gachéine orm. I am here, he says, like a stray goose in a flock of geese, and each one of them is pecking and picking at me. So it is striking then how this obligation was disregarded in the case of children. Another practice which distinguished the burial of children from that of adults was the provision in some cemeteries of a special area reserved for the interment of children. The introduction of these angel plots, as they were known in Ireland, may be linked to the decline in the use of Cillíní in the course of the 19th century. They were introduced in compliance with canon law, which urged that where convenient, baptized infants should be buried in a separate part of the cemetery. Interestingly, this recommendation also led to infants being buried apart, sometimes adjacent to the wall of the cemetery which held their family grave. Church law thus placed infants in a distinct category in relation to the place of burial. And also in church liturgy, there was a special funerary service for children who had not attained the use of reason. It is not unreasonable to suggest that these measures may have had an influence on people's acceptance of traditional practices involving distinctive funerary rites for children, and could even be perceived as offering validation for them. When we consider the diminished and low-key funerary rites of children, a question naturally arises how such practices came to be. Could a possible explanation be provided, for instance, by the views of a school of social history pioneered in the 1960s, promoting the idea that emotional bonding of parents with children in Western society is a relatively recent phenomenon reaching its apex in contemporary society. These historians claim that only in the modern era have parents made the heavy sentimental and psychological investment in their children, which we now regard as normal. Today, a great deal of parents' attention and resources both economic and psychological, are devoted to advancing the well-being of the child. It is pointed out that this was not always so, and in traditional communities, a lack of acknowledgement and appreciation of children is said to have persisted well into the 19th century. The views of some of the main proponents of this school of thought have been summed up as follows. These authors, let's say, believe there has been a steady evolution in the capacity for feeling affection. They're right. Until the middle of the 19th century, there was, among large sections of the population, little tenderness and loving intimacy. The overall picture presented by researchers in the history of childhood varies little. It is suggested, with only a few exceptions, that parents regarded their children with indifference, and there was no appreciation of childhood as a separate state from adulthood, and that harsh discipline was the norm for a lot of children. Many authors claim, in fact, children were systematically abused. Now, among the reasons put forward for the lack of parental bonding with children was the high infant mortality rate in pre-industrial European societies. In pre-famine Ireland, for example, an authoritative estimate claims that 1 child in 5 died in the first year of life. It is argued that child mortality rate, together with large families and the harsh conditions of life, which resulted in children being sent out to work at a tender age, were all factors that deterred parents from being too involved emotionally with their children. They could not afford the emotional strain of seeing numbers of their children dying in childhood, being put out to work, so they were forced to withdraw emotionally from them as a form of psychological protection. If we follow this line of thinking, then Irish funerary rites of children, in not demonstrating a deep sense of loss, could be understood as merely a reflection of the low level of parental bonding with them. However, this pessimistic view of family relations has been challenged by studies showing that parents in various cultures, including our own, did feel affection for their children in earlier centuries, despite practical circumstances not being conducive to demonstrations of it. Furthermore, it has been argued that human biology and psychology would inevitably lead to such bonding. We may take it then that this negative view of family relationships does not offer a satisfactory explanation of the low-key ritual and apparent attachment involved in Irish children's funerary rites. The lack of emotion displayed in children's funerary rites must be viewed in the context of some traditional attitudes and beliefs which could be expected to have a muting effect on expressions of emotion by bereaved parents. These include a measure of stoicism, bolstered by Christian fortitude in accepting personal tragedy as God's will. This aspect of the traditional worldview was a source of great support to people facing life's difficulties and features regularly in folk narrative as an instrument of solace, frequently with a reminder of how much happier the dead child was in the enjoyment of eternal life than living in this wretched world. Also likely to dampen the expression of grief was the ancient belief, found in many cultures, that the dead child would be harmed or made unhappy by tears shed for him. For instance, a traditional international story tells of a dead child returning to ask its parents to stop weeping for it, as the tears burn holes in the child's clothing or body. Belief in the dire consequences of tears shed for a child is illustrated in this slide. Tá sé ráite nach ceart dahar ná máthir éon dúir de ghol, a stíag mac ná an lo I ein bás, mar gan in an gach dúir Paul I golan an duine bhairif, agus go meisiad go léir le fiscintlán de hónis, mar éanise a gine gach duine de hillineat. So that was a stark warning to restrain the grief. In addition, there was a belief that the dead child would be helpful to its parents in getting to heaven. Speaking of 4 of her children who died prematurely, Peg Sayre said, Ismailim iadave aricht de Rome. I am happy that they are in heaven before me, because of her belief that they were preparing a place for her. In one of her stories, she has a character say, Dar da rinne, een binnen a bhain clinne, a hucach in a chinne ruid a bháis, ná bhfuil de hagart a chahabh éide. And another lady informant says, bhíoch áthas ag leanúint bhás lineh, mar thugad sé buanacht na phláis tá bínte. Beliefs such as these were likely to have been instrumental in suppressing expressions of grief on a child's death, and the diminished ritual associated with it, including burial in a Cillíní, should not be taken as indicating a lack of parental affection. In fact, affection for the dead child and concern for its happiness are implied by other aspects of ritual, such as the practice of not using nails in making a coffin for a child, or not fixing an end board to the coffin of a child to allow the child room to grow, or placing a drinking vessel or tin mug in the coffin to the grave so that the child could avail of the supply of milk said to be available in the afterlife. Excavations of burial sites have revealed that tokens of affection may sometimes have been placed in the graves of children. Again, there are numerous protective measures traditionally employed to safeguard the young from malign beings like the fairies or the effect of the evil eye. And these are also the number and the prevalence of these measures and belief associated is an indication of parents' concern for their children. While measures aimed at ensuring physical survival do not necessarily denote an emotional involvement, nevertheless, their great number and frequent use may indicate an intensity of parental concern that falls on the emotional end of the continuum spanning parents' interest in their children. Perhaps the most helpful interpretation of Irish usage associated with child's death is offered by consideration of the nature of ritual. What's going on in ritual? What's the point of it? Ritual can be described as a socially shared activity. It's commonly engaged in the community. It's formalized, in other words, a very definite shape to it, and is repeated in a particular context. In other words, we're talking about traditional customs. Over 100 years ago, a Belgian anthropologist, Arnold van Gennep, made a groundbreaking study of ritual, and some of his conclusions provide meaningful insights into children's funerary rites, including burial in Cillíní. He invented the term rites of passage, the expression used to describe ritual that accompanies critical occasions in human life, the three main ones being birth, marriage, and death. These are status-changing events of social significance in the human life cycle. We go from being unborn to born, from being unmarried to married, from being live to dead. These steps are all acknowledged by society. Ritual has grown up around these occasions and is willfully and freely maintained by the community. The customs involved in ritual can be described as mechanisms developed by society to assist its members in dealing with critical events in their lives. And indeed, it was precisely for that reason that they came to be. Van Gennep revealed an underlying pattern operating in the various customs or rituals attached to these occasions, namely, that their inherent dynamic is designed to facilitate the process of leaving one state, going on a journey towards another, and finally incorporation in the new state. And here, this diagram is very clear that the three stages of ritual in the rites of passage. According to this scheme, then, the function of ritual is to ensure success in negotiating each of these steps, not to express emotion, as noted earlier. So, for instance, in the ritual associated with death, some elements serve the function of ensuring a successful separation from the community of the living. Others are concerned with ensuring a successful journey into the other world, and still others are aimed at achieving successful integration in the community of the dead. Now, some examples of death ritual may help to clarify what I'm trying to say. Many of you are probably aware of the custom of ensuring that one should not stand between a person dying and a door or a window, or that the desirability of opening the door, opening windows in a room where a person is dying. And we can see how this fits easily into this pattern, that this is aiding in the separation of the person from the community of the living. The other more dramatic measures serve the same purpose. For instance, making a hole in the thatch over the bed of the dying person, or removing the dying person from the bed and placing him on the floor, on the earthen floor. This would ease the exit, as it were, of life from this man. The traditional wake, preeminently embodied ritual of separation, and the customs associated with it can be seen to fit a pattern of easing departure in trying to ensure the dead person is duly respected and not unhappy leaving this world. For its duration, it honored him or her by giving communal recognition to the significance of the person's death, and allowed all comers an opportunity to say farewell, partake of food and drink in his honor. A similar function was also served by the merrymaking and game playing, which were once normal features of wakes. Turning to ritual that focus on transition, the last rites play an important role here in bidding the Christian soul depart from this world in the name of God. More significantly, even, the ceremony provides the dying person with Holy Communion or viaticum, originally understood as provisions for a journey. Other elements of the death ritual can also be seen to facilitate crossing into the next world. For example, having the body washed and clothed for a journey. Candles were lit around the deathbed, and these symbolically illuminated the way ahead, making the journey easier. The final step involved in rites of passage, successful integration of the person into the community of the afterlife. Again, the last rites were seen as a very effective way to ensure this, and prayers around the deathbed and burial in consecrated ground served a similar purpose, and also gave people a measure of empowerment. They could help in this process. Other elements of ritual sought to bring a happy integration in the afterlife by focusing on more mundane matters. The afterlife in folk tradition is not confined to that envisaged in Christian teaching, and the dead are portrayed as having worldly requirements and feelings. And very importantly, people especially were careful to ensure that that there was proper clothing and footwear made available for the dead person. And it was quite common for on the death of somebody that clothes would be given to somebody to wear for the dead person. Or even stories of the dead person returning and complaining that his shoes are leaking and he needs a new pair of shoes. And then these will be given to somebody to wear for the dead person. And it's interesting, illustrating how sort of ritual is helpful to people. They can do something about the problem. Yeah. And also, like, care taken to pay off debts the dead person had, fulfill any requests he had made. As outlined earlier, many of the customs associated with adult death are absent or curtailed in children's death ritual. Viewed from the perspective of ritual, the brief span of a child's life meant its ties to family and community were so slight as to render elaborate rites of separation unnecessary. Curtailed rites of separation and transition were felt to be adequate when the child had integrated so little with the community. The diminished ritual involved in the wake and funeral of a child can then be interpreted as appropriate to its status. Similarly, rites of integration were not required for a baptized child, as its sinless state guaranteed it an assured place in heaven. Indeed, an especially satisfactory incorporation in the community of the blessed. The child's innocence and tender age obviated the need for last rites. Burial in a less honorable location than the cemetery reflected in the child's lowly status. After all, the ritual of Christian burial is calculated to assist in achieving successful integration in the afterlife by having the dead person laid to rest in the community of the faithful awaiting resurrection. In brief then, the short lifespan of the child, shallowness of his integration in society in earlier times meant a low level of social status, and this in turn led to diminished ritual accompanying its death and burial. The unbaptized child, however, belonged to a special category, considered incapable of achieving satisfactory membership in the company of the dead, and consequently doomed to exist in a liminal state, the disquieting nature of which was exacerbated by popular notions of limbo as a state, to a place of darkness cut off from the sight of God. That's a separate story. Now, looking at the situation today, contemporary child death ritual, the status of the child differs greatly from that of children in the previous era, which may not actually have been so long ago. Some of us might even belong to the generation where children were to be seen but not heard. The child in modern times has become a central focus of the family's economy and energy, and parents make a huge sentimental and psychological investment in their children. In recent times, the greater significance afforded children, both within the family and by the community, has meant that traditional death rituals no longer truly reflected people's sentiments. And this, as might be expected, has led to a reappraisal of former practices. Nowadays, children's obsequies contrast sharply with those of even a few generations ago, in the acknowledgement given the death of a child, however young, and the recognition given to the loss of the bereaved. Children's funerals today are events of social significance, acknowledged not only within the extended family, but also within the local community and work associates of parents. The ritual today reflects the centrality of the child in contemporary family and community life, and is expressive of powerful familial bonding even in infancy. Because of this, a more elaborate ritual is appropriate in undoing his ties with family and community. The quality of the coffin, the use of a hearse, large attendance at a conveniently timed funeral, celebration of a special funeral mass as part of the obsequies, and finally burial in the family grave, at which clergy usually officiate, followed by a social gathering, all point to the acceptance of the child in some instances, even if stillborn, as an acknowledged member of family and community. Evidence of a grassroots reassessment of the practice of extracimmeterial burials in Cillíní is manifest towards the end of the last century. An early indication is provided by an account of a woman from Tina in County Galway, who had given birth to 3 illegitimate children, and on her death in 1840 had been refused Christian burial and was interred in an unconsecrated location. However, in 1984, parishioners and clergy arranged for the reburial of her remains in the consecrated ground of the local cemetery. In 1991, the mother of unbaptized twin babies, buried in a children's burial ground near Grenville in the 1930s, began a successful campaign reported in the national press to have the burial ground blessed. Such public recognition of the inadequacies of these sites as resting place for deceased children reveals a change in attitude, and in the years following, various communities directed attention to the children's burial ground in their localities. Social employment schemes were availed of to tidy them up, repair walls, erect small monuments in memory of those buried there, and mark the hidden grief of their families, and in some instances, an annual pilgrimage to the site has been initiated. Significant impetus was given to such development by the sesquicentennial celebration of the Great Famine in 1997. The sites being particularly appropriate for attention in this context, as they were often referred to as famine graveyards. The burial grounds were also the focus of community schemes to mark the celebration of the Millennium Year, and subsequent to that, many of these locales were restored, religious services held in them, and memorial stones erected. Common Gaeltacht Anahún played its part in this, and congratulations are due to those responsible for the restoration of Cillíní in Craigdove. In recent years also, the angel plots in some cemeteries have been given special attention, and graves have been refurbished, some for the first time provided with inscribed headstones. The most widely publicised incident of dissatisfaction with former practice was brought about by the dedication of Catherine Corliss and her colleagues in bringing the alarming manner of burial of children in the Tuam Mother and Baby Home to national attention. Public outcry at practices uncovered there led eventually to the government setting up a commission of investigation, not only into the Tuam home, but also others elsewhere in the country. The establishment of the Commission of Investigation in 2015 marks the high point in public dissatisfaction with former practices. To conclude, this talk can be summed up very simply by saying rites of passage are devised by society to facilitate dealing with critical life events. The level of ritual is determined by the social status of the individual, and the relative lack of status for the children in times gone by is reflected in the funerary rites traditionally provided to them. The contemporary upward shift in the status of the child has led to a reassessment of former practices, leading to the development of funerary rituals which accord with present-day sensitivities. Grumagh.